The dust never left your lungs in Keshvarad. Dolan Voss had learned that in his first month, coughed black for a year after, and eventually stopped noticing it the way a man stops noticing the ache of an old wound. 6 years now, maybe 6.5. He'd stopped trusting his own count somewhere around year 4, when the guards had changed the shift bells just to watch prisoners lose track of time, laughing at the small cruelty of it from the observation deck above the tunnels. He was 31 years old and looked 50, broad shoulders gone lean and wire-hard from swinging a pick 14 hours a day, skin gray-pale under permanent grime, eyes the flat, careful eyes of a man who had trained himself never to show hope where a guard might see it and take it away out of spite. Humanity did not have friends in the galaxy. That much every child born after the Accord's founding understood instinctively, the way they understood gravity. Humans lived under quarantine sol system and its handful of colonies walled in by treaty. Forbidden ships, forbidden expansion, forbidden even curiosity about certain sealed sectors of space. Ask why, and the answer was always the same maddening non-answer, the Ashfall incident. 2 words, no history attached. Just a silence so total it had calcified into law. Dolan had given up asking why a long time ago. Survival didn't leave room for why. The tunnel he worked that day was new, cut 2 weeks prior by a blasting crew chasing a Duralite seam that ran unnaturally straight through bedrock that should have been chaos and fracture lines. Geology didn't run straight. He thought that more than once, swinging his pick into stone that gave way too cleanly, but thinking too hard about anything in the pit was its own kind of danger, so he'd let it go each time. He couldn't let it go today. His pick struck rock and the rock answered wrong, a hollow ringing note instead of the dull thud he'd swung 10,000 times before. He froze, breath caught and struck again, softer, listening. Hollow, definitely hollow. Around him the tunnel was empty. Skarn, the shift's Thrin overseer, had gone topside 20 minutes ago to deal with a supply dispute, leaving Dolan and 2 others working a side vein 40 meters back. For the first time in longer than he could remember, nobody was watching him. He struck the wall a 3rd time, harder, and a slab the size of a door face cracked and folded inward like old scab peeling from a wound long healed beneath. Behind it, not stone, metal. Dark, ribbed, layered in a pattern of overlapping plates that no mining conglomerate on this rock had ever built, running with a texture that looked less like architecture and more like hull. Dust drifted from the gap. Something in the air beyond it smelled faintly, impossibly, of ozone, the smell of powered systems, of electricity still, somehow, alive. Dolan lifted his lamp with a hand that had stopped shaking 6 years ago, and had suddenly, inexplicably, started again. 7 letters, stenciled in weathered but legible Roman characters, caught the light. UES Kodiak. He knew those letters. English. Old English. Pre-Accord, pre-quarantine, pre-everything he'd ever been taught to believe about his own species' quiet, contained apologetic place among the stars. His pulse hammered against his ribs so hard he could feel it in his throat. Behind him, distant but closing, he heard the unmistakable clack of a Thrin guard's segmented boots on tunnel stone. He had perhaps 4 seconds to decide what kind of man he was about to become. Voss. Skarn's voice arrived a half-second before Skarn himself did, rounding the tunnel bend with his pulse rod already raised. 3 independent eyes swiveling in that unsettling Thren way. One fixed on Dolan, one sweeping the tunnel behind him, one characteristically drifting toward nothing useful at all. You stopped digging. The rod's tip cast a thin blue light across the rock. Digging is the only reason I let you keep breathing my air, meedling. Explain. Doolin's body was already between Skarn and the gap in the wall, though he hadn't consciously decided to stand there. Some animal part of him had made the choice a half-second before his mind caught up. His heart was slamming so hard he was certain the guard could hear it. Vane went dead, he said, keeping his voice flat, bored, the voice of 6 years of practiced invisibility. Hit bedrock, nothing here. Skarn's foremost eye narrowed, unconvinced, and he took 2 more steps forward, close enough now that Dolan could smell the acrid chemical musk that passed for Thren's sweat. Bedrock, Skarn repeated, tasting the lie in the word the way a man tastes spoiled meat. Move aside. There was no story left that survived Skarn actually looking. 6 years of the pit had taught Dolan exactly one lesson worth keeping. When the moment to think has passed, the only thing left is to move. He swung the pick not for Skarn's skull, some fragment of mercy or self-preservation choosing for him, but sideways into the guard's rod arm. The weapon fired wide, punching a smoking crater into the tunnel ceiling in a shower of sparks and grit, and Skarn shrieked, a high, brittle sound. Thren bones were famously thin for creatures their size, built for speed over durability, and something in that arm had just given way with a wet crack. Dolan didn't stop to think about what he'd become. He drove his shoulder into Skarn's chest and put the guard down hard onto the tunnel floor. Then did the one thing 6 years of survival instinct had drilled into him never, ever to do. He picked up the fallen pulse rod and didn't put it back down. Skarn's shoulder cum was already crackling. Panicked Thren dialect spilling out, breach, tunnel 9, requesting immediate response. And Dolan crushed the unit under his heel with a violence that surprised him. Silence blooming in the tunnel like something holy. He turned to the gap in the wall. The Kodiak's hull curved away into darkness in both directions, vast and buried and utterly silent. And near his shoulder height he found what his hands recognized before his mind did. A maintenance hatch, corroded at the seams but whole. The exact shape of every emergency access port he'd seen in old documentary footage as a boy, before the world outside Earth's walls had shrunk down to nothing. He wedged the pick into the seam and threw every remaining ounce of strength into the lever. Behind him, down the tunnel, boots were multiplying. 3 sets, 4, shouting orders in overlapping Thren dialects. The hatch groaned, ancient hydraulics remembering after 2,000 years what movement felt like, and gave way all at once, spilling him forward into a darkness that was, against every possible reason, warm. Something in there was still running on power. Dolan Vass, prisoner 4471 of the Kesfer Ed mining colony, climbed into a 2,000-year-old human warship with armed guards closing in behind him, and for the first time in 6 years felt something other than despair crawl up through his chest. He felt afraid of the right thing for once in his life. The corridor beyond the hatch swallowed sound the way old places do. Thick, dust-heavy silence broken only by his own ragged breathing, and the distant muffled thud of the tunnel hatch buckling under something far heavier than fists. He had minutes, maybe less. He didn't stop moving. A single line of amber light traced along the floor ahead of him, pulsing faint and slow like a heartbeat too stubborn to have ever fully stopped. He followed it without deciding to, boots echoing on decking that hadn't felt a footstep since before the Accord's founding treaty had ink dried on its signatures. The corridor opened into a command deck, small, built for a crew of Dolan guests at no more than a dozen, every console dark, every screen dead glass throwing his own hollow wide reflection back at him. He almost turned around right there, certain he'd found nothing but a tomb. Then the tomb spoke. Crew member deity satiated, a UDHNTA CTING. The voice was flat, synthetic, and unmistakably, achingly human. English, but accented strangely in cadences that belonged to no country Dolan had ever heard. An accent that had, perhaps only ever existed aboard this single vessel, born and dying with it. Emergency lighting bled to life along the ceiling seams, dim red first, brightening steadily as systems he couldn't name groaned awake one by one. Decades, centuries of dormant circuitry, remembering purpose. A console flickered, cleared, resolved into a single glowing word. Kodiak. I'm not crew, Dolan said, breathless, because it felt important to say even to a machine, even with boots pounding closer through the tunnel behind him. I'm a prisoner. I broke through a wall. Genetic markers confirm Homo sapiens. Authentication sufficient for emergency protocols. Welcome aboard, crewman. You don't understand. Applying closer now, alien voices urgent, multiplying. They're coming armed. I don't have time to threat assessment. THREN and mercenary force, armed hostile intent, DETCTED. Kodiak assessment, negligible. The word landed strangely in the dead, red-lit air. Negligible. Dolan almost laughed. The wild, cracked laugh of a man too far past fear to process anything calmly. Ship status. Reactor at T4% capacity, sufficient for defensive operations. Hull integrity 94%. Weapons SYSTMS offline, manual reactivation required. Query. Do you authorize combat PROTOCOL's crewman? Dolan stared at the console, at the amber light, steady and patient now, at 2,000 years of buried silence, finally finding anyone to speak to. Behind him, the tunnel hatch shrieked metal tearing, and Theron voices poured through in overlapping shouts, weapons raised, screaming for him to get down, to surrender, to make this easy for everyone but him. Easy for everyone but him. Dolan Voss, who had spent 6 years learning precisely how small a man could be made to feel, looked at the console, glow, and said the only word that felt entirely terrifyingly true. Yes, first Theron through the door died without ever understanding why. Kodiak's point defense turret a squat, unremarkable housing, set into the corridor ceiling that 2,000 years of alien archaeological surveys had somehow never flagged because it had never once fired, tracked, and discharged in the same fractional heartbeat. A single railgun slug punched clean through. Theron plate armor as though the armor were wet paper stretched over nothing at all. The second and third mercenaries didn't manage a scream before the turret cycled and fired again. Dolan flinched violently at every shot, pressed flat against the command console, watching a battle that lasted 11 seconds from start to finish, and left behind nothing but silence, the tang of ozone, and the sharp stink of cauterized alloy drifting through recyclers that hadn't circulated air in 2 millennia. Threat neutralized, 3 hostiles eliminated, no further contacts detected within immediate perimeter. That's it, Doolan's voice cracked high, and unfamiliar in his own ears. 3 men dead, just like that. Affirmative query, elevated distress indicators detected in your voice pattern, medical assistance required. No, I'm not hurt. He pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes, chest heaving. 6 years in the pit had shown him violence in every casual, ugly shape the Accord permitted against men who had no one to complain to. Never once had he seen it turned outward, inverted. 3 armed soldiers erased by a machine, reporting the fact the way another man might mention the weather. Observation: you appear distressed by minimal force application. Clarification requested. Was engagement undesired? They would have killed me. Correct. Therefore, engagement was necessary and proportionate. Kodiak assessment remains unchanged. THRNN forces represent negligible threat to ship systems or crew safety. Requesting context update. What is the current galactic political state? Last logged external contact was 2,114 years, 47 days prior to present stardate. Dolan laughed then, and it came out broken. Half a sob dragged up from somewhere he'd sealed off years ago. 2,000 years. This ship, this thing that had just erased 3 armed men in 11 seconds, without its weapons even reaching a third of stated capacity, had slept that long, and its first instinct on waking was to ask for a briefing. Humanity's contained, he managed. No ships of our own, no colonies past our home system. There's an accord now, species councils, treaties, and humans live under quarantine. Nobody explains why. There's a phrase everyone uses, and nobody defines the Ashfall incident. The ship went silent for a long, strange moment. When it spoke again, something in its flat, synthetic cadence had shifted. Not warmth exactly, but weight. The tone of a man remembering a debt he'd believed long settled. Ashfall, query acknowledged. Kodiak retains relevant archival data regarding the Ashfall incident. Classification: United Earth Security Level Omega. Outside down the tunnel, more voices were gathering. Reinforcements now angrier, calling for heavier weapons. Later, Dolan said, and surprised himself with how steady it came out. Tell me later. Right now, can you fly? Negative. Hull is encased within approximately 2 kilometers of planetary regolith. Recommend alternate strategy. What strategy? Recommend we make them come to us. Colony Warden Thesik Drav had governed the Kesfarid mining operation for 11 years, without a single incident serious enough to reach Accord attention, and he had every intention of keeping that record intact right up until his security chief walked into his office, looking like a man who had already started composing his own resignation letter. 1 prisoner, the chief said, voice tighter than Drav had ever heard it. 1 human killed 3 of our men in a corridor that isn't on any survey map. Then map it and kill him, Drav snapped, not looking up from his ledgers. Warden, the chief hesitated, a genuinely unusual thing for a Threen officer to do. The tunnel walls down there, they're not natural rock, and there's a structure underneath. Human-built, old, the kind of old that predates. Drav understood before the sentence finished, and the understanding dropped through him like ice water poured straight into his chest cavity. Every mining operation licensed under Confederated Accord law operated beneath one absolute, unbreakable statute, printed in letters too large to ever misread. Any artifact of pre-ashfall human origin discovered anywhere within Confederated space must be reported immediately to Accord Central Command and left entirely untouched pending military containment. Nobody had ever explained to Drav precisely what an ashfall artifact was in this specific sense. Nobody had ever needed to. A law written with that much severity around something so specific didn't require explanation. Its existence was the explanation. Pull everyone back, Drav said. All of them. Nobody goes near that tunnel again. And the prisoner, sir? Drav thought of the fine print buried in every mining conglomerate standard contract. Boilerplate nobody bothered reading until the day it mattered. Discovery of ashfall classified material voids all standard containment protocols. Accord Fleet Command assumes full jurisdiction effective immediately, which meant in blunt, practical terms that the instant he filed this report, the pit and every soul inside it stopped being his problem and became someone else's. Someone with considerably larger guns. Leave him, Drav said quietly, already reaching for the emergency relay. He's not ours anymore. He's the fleet's. 600 light-years distant in a starlit command tower above the Accord's gleaming capital world. That report landed on the desk of Fleet Marshal Yeth Corvin with the particular weight reserved for words. Nobody in his position ever wanted to read twice. Pre-ashfall vessel located. Human survivor in possession. Recommend immediate fleet deployment. Corvin had been a young officer during the Ashfall War itself, one of only a few hundred serving Accord officers still alive who remembered firsthand precisely what human ships had once been capable of before the Quarantine Treaty chained the species down. He remembered burning skis over 3 Allied homeworlds. He remembered signing his name to a peace built entirely on fear dressed up as diplomacy. He read the report twice, hoping the second reading would change it. It didn't. Muster the Third Fleet, he said finally, voice flat. Full deployment. No exceptions. And may every god this galaxy has ever prayed to help us if that ship is what I think it is. Deep inside Kodiak's hull, behind a bulkhead Dolan hadn't yet found, something else had stirred awake alongside the ship's reactor. Its memory. Ashfall archive fully decrypted, Kodiak announced as Dolan sat slumped against the command console, exhausted, listening for footsteps that hadn't returned in over an hour. Playback available. Advisory, content remains classified under United Earth Security Protocol. There's no United Earth left to enforce that, Dolan said, throat raw. Play it. The console flickered, and for a long moment Dolan found himself looking at a face. A woman, uniformed, wearing the exact particular exhaustion of someone who had been awake and afraid for far too long, in a way no amount of sleep would ever fully fix. This is Fleet Admiral Renata Asai, log entry day 1100 of the Ashfall campaign. The recording said, her voice steady, despite everything her eyes betrayed. For whoever finds this, human or otherwise, you should understand what happened here wasn't conquest. It was survival, nothing more, nothing less. The recording continued, unhurried, and Dolan listened in a silence so complete he could hear his own pulse, understanding at last what 2,000 years of Accord history books had scrubbed clean away. Humanity hadn't started a war. 3 alien powers watching an unaligned species expand. Rapidly through unclaimed frontier space had moved to annex Earth's fledgling colonies before humanity could formally join the newly forming Confederated Accord and earn its protections. What followed hadn't been aggression. It had been humanity fighting a defensive war on 3 fronts simultaneously, using ships exactly like the Kodiak, built desperate and fast and brutally, mercilessly effective, because losing meant nothing short of extinction. Humanity won, not through numbers, through ships that thought for themselves, crews who refused to break, and a doctrine of overwhelming, relentless response that had, by the war's final year, reduced 2 aggressor empires to ash and left the third begging, genuinely begging for terms. "We won," OSIS recording said, quieter now, almost tired. And it terrified everyone who watched us do it. So they wrote the Accord's founding treaty specifically to contain us, to guarantee no human fleet would ever rise again. And we agreed. We were exhausted. We told ourselves peace was worth the chains. The recording ended in silence. Kodiak was one of 412 at war's end, the ship continued. Buried rather than destroyed as insurance against future necessity. Query Dahlia Voss, you are recognized human crew. Do you authorize full combat readiness? Dolan thought of 6 years underground, of a species that had won an impossible war, and then agreed, out of sheer exhaustion, to spend 2,000 years pretending it never had. Somewhere above them, he knew with total certainty, an Accord fleet was already burning fuel toward this moon to bury the secret a second time, with him sealed inside it. "Yes," he said. "Wake up all the way." Accord's third fleet dropped out of transit above Kesvareth's moon 11 hours later. 41 warships arranged in tight defensive formation, sensor arrays screaming, every weapon aboard, trained on a patch of gray rock that until that morning had been nothing more significant than a mining operations backlot. Fleet Marshal Corvin stood rigid on his flagship's bridge, watching the scan data resolve, silently praying the buried signature would turn out small. It didn't. In fact, it resolved to a single vessel, 1 hull buried, already drawing enough power to register clean on deep sensors, flagged by his tactical computer with the designation nobody aboard had seen outside sealed historical archives. 1 ship, his tactical officer reported, disbelief bleeding through her professional calm. 1 human vessel buried, already active. "Sir, should we bombard the surface before it achieves full power?" "No." Corvin's voice came out flatter than he intended. "You don't bombard a wound. You address the cause." Below, deep in rock, Dolan felt the entire ship shudder as regolith above them, weakened by 2 millennia, and finally answering to Kodiak's restored reactor output, began to crack and shift and give way. "Hull breach imminent, intentional," Kodiak reported with something that might, in a human voice, have passed for grim satisfaction. Recommend bracing. We are about to surface. Kodiak, there's an entire fleet waiting up there. Affirmative. 41 vessels detected. Assessment, moderate threat given currently reduced system capacity. Recommend diplomatic overture prior to any engagement. Should engagement prove unavoidable. You want to talk to them? I want to offer them the opportunity to leave. What happens after that is entirely their choice. The moon's surface erupted in a towering column of ancient dust and shattered rock as Kodiak breached clean through. Hull scarred but whole, reactor glow bleeding blue-white light across a battlefield that hadn't existed a single hour earlier. 41 Accord warships trained every weapon system they carried on a vessel a fraction of their combined size. Corvin's communications officer looked up sharply, face pale. "Sir, they're transmitting." The message that reached every ship in the Third Fleet simultaneously wasn't a threat. It was something considerably worse than a threat. It was calm. "This is UES Kodiak, United Earth Fleet, reactivated under crew authority. We are not seeking conflict. We request safe passage and formal recognition of crewman DAHLEN Voss as a free citizen under the original terms of the ASHFALL Armistice, Article 7. Additional note, Kodiak retains the full unredacted text of that armistice. We would much prefer not to share it with every media relay in Confederated space. The choice, Marshal, is entirely yours." On the bridge of his flagship, Fleet Marshal Yeth Corvin, a man who had signed a treaty 2,000 years buried in convenient half-truths, understood with perfect clarity exactly what was being offered him. Not a battle, a trade, and quietly a mercy he hadn't expected to be extended. The negotiations stretched 6/10 hours and ended with 41 Accord warships holding position at a careful, humble distance while a single unarmed shuttle crossed the gap toward Kodiak's battle-scarred hull. Fleet Marshal Corvin came aboard alone, against the frantic objections of every adviser he had, and found Dolan Voss standing on a command deck humming now with restored patient power. A former prisoner, still in filthy mining fatigues, standing where an admiral's chair should rightfully sit, looking entirely, disarmingly unbothered by the man who nominally commanded 41 warships of firepower. "You understand?" Corvin said, carefully choosing each word. "What you're asking for changes everything. The unredacted armistice going public doesn't just free you. It exposes every foundation the Accord's authority was quietly built on." "I understand," Dolan said. "That I spent 6 years breaking rock in a mining pit for a crime that amounted to nothing more than being born human. And I understand this ship," he gestured at the dim, patient bulkheads humming around them, "spent 2,000 years buried alive because your ancestors were too frightened of a truth to bury it properly the first time. I'm not asking for a war marshal. I am asking for the truth to stop being classified." "Kodiakconsurs." The ship added smoothly. "THOUGHKODIAK would note for the record 41 vessels against 1. Remains technically a favorable engagement ratio for this ship. This is not a threat. It is simply an observation." Corvin very nearly smiled, despite the gravity pressing down on the room. He had braced himself for fury from a 2,000-year-old warship. He had not, in any scenario he'd rehearsed on the shuttle ride over, braced for dry humor. "The Council will not like this," he admitted quietly. "The Council," Bellman said, "has had 2,000 years to build an entire galaxy on the foundation of a species it was too afraid to trust. Maybe it's finally time they learn what happens when that species gets a voice again." The unredacted Ashfall armistice reached every major news relay across Confederated space within the week. Not delivered as an act of war, but as a quiet, devastating correction to the historical record. The galaxy learned all at once in stunned unison that humanity had never been contained as punishment for aggression it committed. It had been contained out of fear, dressed carefully in the language of law, sustained by a silence 3,000 years thick and never once questioned. Dolman Voss became, against every instinct the pit had ever carved into him, a reluctant symbol, the freed prisoner who found a buried warship and chose to wield its patience instead of its guns. He asked for no statue, no title. He asked only that the other buried ships, 411 more, scattered and sleeping across 100 forgotten worlds, be found at last and returned to whoever their crew's descendants might now be. Kodiak, for its part, resumed the only mission it had ever truly finished, waiting for someone worth protecting and finding at long last that the wait was over. "Crewman Voss," the ship said quietly, as the newly opened skies above Kesvarad's moon stretched wide for the first time in 2,000 years. "Query, where would you like to go?" Dolman looked out at stars he had never once, in 6 years of digging through the dark, truly expected to see again as a free man. "Home," he said softly. "Let's go find out what that word even means now."